Are you feeling comfortable? Great, then I'll begin. Since the dawn of civilization, stories have been told to explain the origins of the world. Among them, one stands out: Greek mythology. Why, even after millennia, do these tales continue to captivate us? Greek mythology is not merely a collection of fantastical narratives. It is a mirror of the human soul and a cornerstone of Western thought. It reflects the doubts, fears, and aspirations of a people who, through myth, sought to understand the world and their own destiny. Yet, Greek myth did not remain in the past, alongside a civilization that dissipates and recreates itself. They live on in cinema, literature, games, and even in our everyday language. When we speak of an Achilles heel or a Pandora's box, we echo voices from an immortal time. It is impossible to inhabit the West at any point in post-Hellenic history without encountering Greeks. In this documentary, guided by Pierre Grimal's book, Greek Mythology, we will delve into the roots of this study with one of its great thinkers. We will not retell the stories, but offer an introduction to the study of myth itself, according to Grimal. Thus, using this report, we will lay the foundation for future analysis, where each new article, video, and text will help us better understand the impact and legacy of the ancient Greek world. Chapter 1. The Myth. The Greek myth, mythos, exists beyond mere storytelling. It is a force in itself. But what makes Greek mythology so unique? To understand it, we must look beyond Greece. We must look at the mythologies of the world. There are myths in which superior beings and cosmic forces rule over humanity, where every heroic deed is a cosmic event, creating and shaping the universe, directly influencing the course of events across the entire plane of creation. The creational Indian myths are examples of this kind. There are myths dominated by the epic. The origin of the world is not in question. Gods and humans exist separately, and more importantly, without interference. We find this kind of myth among the Celtic peoples who inhabited Britain. Lastly, there are myths in which time erodes their fabulous nature, leaving them disguised as fact. It is what happened in Rome, for example. Many so-called facts are corrupted versions of what, in ancient times, was an authentic mythical narrative. What was once myth becomes historical. The Greek myth absorbs all of these forms and transcends them. Within human expression, we have the logos, thought itself. It demands proof to support its reasoning. It argues, persuades. It begins and ends in mental exercise. But mythos, its counterpart, does not ask for belief. It simply is. Myth does not explain. It reveals. It creates images, symbols, ways to express the ineffable. Through myth, humanity reaches what would otherwise be unreachable. An entire region of the soul is opened. In this sense, myth permeates all the activities of the spirit and knows no borders. It is essential to thought and to life, as it has a life of its own. It is important to mention that we are not analyzing belief in myths themselves. By the classical period of Greece, literal belief in the Olympian gods had already weakened. which does not diminish the validity, importance, or relevance of their myths. Whether believed in or not, it is the foundation of all Greek meditation and the Western way of living. But how is a myth born? Beyond stories that retell the origin of the universe and the idea that myth arose to justify natural events, which, in fact, may have been the primary source of a mythology that far exceeds nature, myth is also a historical source that preserves testimonies which would have been forgotten if they had not been condensed. They must be interrogated to reveal what they preserve of the time and place in which they were created. We must ask ourselves, which elements of the myth show us, millennia later, how those people lived? Greek mythology is a patchwork in which multiple versions of myths are stitched together. It did not arise complete, finished, and bound in a single book handed to the people. It is the result of countless years of stories and tales which are transformed with each new telling, carrying with them a bit of the storyteller and the place in which they emerge. Greece was not a vast country, but a region in the Mediterranean formed by people who shared a cultural vision. Each state developed in its own way, just as its myths. In this sense, Greek mythology has multiple versions of the same myth. The birth of Aphrodite, for example, the birth of Zeus, Dionysus. All these versions coexist with equal importance. It only becomes kind of a problem when there is an attempt to create a pan-Hellenic mythology. In other words, when all those tribes are unified under a single context. If we think about it, divergences between myths only emerge once there is reflection on myth itself. When a science of myth arises. Wait, a science of myth? How does that work? When philosophers appear and begin to think about the myth in terms of rational and structured creation, seeking coherence, it comes to inhabit the domain of logos, leaving behind mythos itself. We previously analyzed different types of mythology. Now, within Greek mythology specifically, let us analyze the types of myths. We have the cosmogonic or theogonic myths. These are accounts concerning the formation of the world and the birth or emergence of the gods. They are myths of origins, telling us who the gods were and what existed before them. A great example is Hesiod's Theogony, in which the author presents himself as an Aedo, a bard, recounting battles, intrigues, unions, loves, and terrors, all leading to Zeus reigning supreme as the king of gods. We also have the divine and heroic cycles, an evolutionary series of episodes whose only connection is the identity of the hero. They carry no cosmic significance. The central figure may be a semi-divine man or even a god. These are expanding, patchwork cycles, incorporating even tales recognized in other cultures. Here, the myth doesn't justify anything. It simply tells a story following the life of a god or a hero, telling us what happened in their journey and the symbolism attached to them, with no great impact on the world. And there is the novella. Defined by intrigue, it has specific settings and no cosmic or symbolic value. It is merely literary, but at one time it was believed to be true. Myths are plastic. They adapt to each category according to need. Mythology is an organism, the result of endless pulse and metamorphosis, if not an outright evolution. And it is from this living matter, the myth, that the Greek world began to shape its imagination and ours. But enough with the concepts and academics. Let's now dive into some of the myths and taste the ancient world. Chapter 2: The Theogonic Myths. It is necessary at this point to separate Greek divine creation into distinct phases. When we speak of theogonic myths, that is, myths about the creation of the gods, we do not begin with the cycle of the Olympian gods, whom we are more familiar with: Zeus, Aphrodite, Athena, Apollo, etc. Some ruled before them. We will start with more ancient figures, protagonists of a primordial era: Uranus, Gaia, Cronus, Rhea, and others. But if they are so important, where did they go? What happened to them? It is also important to highlight a specific aspect. These deities, called Titans, are, at a certain point, cast aside and imprisoned in Tartarus, a deep abyss in the underworld. They were certainly worshipped in ancient times, but their rites and memories were buried even before the formation of Hellenic identity. This entire Titanic generation is condemned to oblivion and silence. But what did the Titans represent? These ancient powers maintain a deep connection with nature. They are primordial entities, tied to elemental forces: moon, sun, dawn, stars, winds. There is both a logical and symbolic explanation here. As natural elements are the first forces to impact human life, it is only natural that they were the first to demand explanatory myths. This structure follows the very evolution of Greek thought. In the beginning, wild and uncontrollable deities arise, reflections of untamed nature itself. Once environmental phenomena are explained, thought undergoes a transformation. It becomes more social, more abstract, more inward-looking. Thus, the temporal evolution of myths also reflect what the Greeks themselves sought to understand. But something lurks on the edges of this untamed, transforming world. The pre-Olympian generation includes, if not all, the majority of the monsters known in myth. These are the creatures that, later, in a symbolic inversion, will serve as enemies and antagonists to mortal heroes when they come to occupy the center of mythical narratives. The Titanic generation is relegated to the condition of demons, forgotten or imprisoned deities, while the Olympians assume control of the cosmos. Zeus takes his father's place, dismembers him, and imprisons him in Tartarus after a great battle, the Titanomachy. When Zeus triumphs, he and the other gods begin the ordering of the world. It is here that the old regime ends and the new one begins. With the end of the Titanomachy, the cycle of the Olympians begin. Chapter 3: The Olympian Cycle. In the Olympian generation, the gods do not represent only natural forces, but also human concepts: justice, vengeance, love, war, the arts. The Olympian gods can be divided between those who born of Cronus, the so-called Cronids, and those of other origins. Despite being born of the great titans, the Chronids do not hold a rigid hierarchy among them, except for Zeus, of course, the greatest one. The Chronids are Zeus, god of the skies, Poseidon, king of the seas, Hades, ruler of the underworld. We also have Hera, wife of Zeus, goddess of marriage, Demeter, goddess of agriculture, and Hestia, goddess of the hearth. The other gods considered greater on Olympus, who, along with the 6 Chronids, make up the so-called Council of the Gods, are Apollo, Artemis, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Ares, Hermes, and Dionysus. Each of these gods has their own origin myth. Apollo and Artemis are children of Leto and are already persecuted by Hera at birth. Dionysus is the son of Zeus and Semele, who is killed by a scheme of Hera. Hephaestus, in one of his mythical versions, is thrown from Olympus and thus ends up with a deformed appearance. Aphrodite, according to one version, is born when the blood of Uranus falls into the sea, arising from the foam. To see the evolution of the various myths and stories that make up the cycle of the gods is to perceive not only the dimension the myths attained, but also how reflection on these figures and their symbolism evolved as the Greeks came to recognize themselves as authors of their own creations and thoughts. 2 gods must be specially emphasized: Zeus and Dionysus. Zeus is the most powerful god, and the entire order of the world originates from him. By studying his cycle, the regional diversity of Greece becomes evident. Zeus has different myths and personalities in each region, although his identity as king of Olympus remains. From him derive many of the Greek royal dynasties, which justified the monarchy pretensions of kings. However, it is important to know that despite this, mankind in its entirety do not descend from Zeus, but from Deucalion, son of Prometheus. This Olympian journey culminates in the birth of the last of the gods, the most human one. Dionysus. His cult, through art, intoxication, and catharsis, will open the doors to the emergence of philosophy. Son of Zeus is one of the gods whose cycle is clearest and most cohesive, almost like a biography. Although he was already part of the pantheon in the classical period, his more recent and structured cult suggests a later introduction, as if resulting from a Thracian invasion, just as described in his own myth. In examining the cycle of Dionysus and attempting to understand both his origin and his destiny, his figure as a god who dies and resurrects, son of the most powerful god in the pantheon and a mortal woman, focused on helping marginalized people who begin to follow and worship him while he transforms beverages into wine, we are led to reflect on his invasion and permanence. Dionysus often suffers and must prove himself the son of the most powerful god in order to claim his place. His journey is one of pain and power, and to commune with him means transformation and redemption. What does this narrative reveal about the Greek perception of salvation and divine legitimacy? What is then Dionysus' function? What place does his prototype occupy within theology and the experience of the sacred? At times, the gods do not act directly, but through their favorite among humans, tasked with carrying out deeds and labors in their name. Let us now take a closer look at these heroes. Chapter 4: The Cycle of Heroes. The cycle of heroes differs from that of the gods for a rather simple reason. While the gods are worshipped figures whose experience is ever present in daily life, heroes are mythological figures built as characters within their own stories. They emerge in a much more structured and literary form, albeit often in fragmented versions. Naturally, being characters and narratives, their lives depend much more on literary and historical records than on cults or devotional practices. Just like the cycles of the gods, the cycles of heroes must also be the object of critical and historiographical reflection. As previously stated, a myth can lose its epic characteristics and become a mere event, but the opposite is also true. An event can transform into myth. Much of what we understand as heroic cycles may have originated in historical events which, with the addition of a detail at each retelling, became grand and epic stories filled with gods and mythical happenings. Could the transformation of historical memory into myth be a form of cultural preservation? The answer, of course, is yes. Just like any other myth, when we hear a narrative belonging to a heroic cycle, we must listen with the intent of understanding what that myth preserves of its temporal context. Beyond the journeys, fights, and battles, the heroic cycles, unlike some of the Olympian myths, take place entirely in recognizable locations within the Hellenic world. They are excerpts of historical events that have been clothed in epic attributes. These accounts suggest exoduses, conflicts, and customs that, having not been preserved in written records, have reached us only through the epics of the heroes. Without these myths, such traces of Hellenic culture would have been lost to time. These cycles date back to the Mycenaean civilization and transport us to a more historically defined period of Greek history. When compared to the theological myths, their narratives may present a slightly more consistent time structure. Many of their original sources have not survived, and the earliest accounts were at times lost or altered to such a degree that it is impossible to determine what the first version of each story was. Among the most celebrated cycles we have Jason and the Argonauts, the Theban cycle, Heracles, Theseus, and Odysseus. These narratives, although structured as lost heroic epics, carry within themselves the essential trait of all Greek myth, their plasticity. Retold over the centuries, adapted to different regions and times, they assume new forms and functions with each generation that transmits them, each with their own hero. Come, it is at this point that we dive even deeper into the heart of mythology, into the very life of myths, into their capacity to reinvent themselves, to survive time, and to continue speaking to the human spirit. Chapter 5: The Life of Legends. A Greek myth is always a complex elaboration. Because it dates so far back in time, reflection on it is also ancient, and it arrives to modern men already modified and reworked countless times. It does not follow a linear evolution. Each myth has its origin, its epic, philosophical, or sophistic phase. As a result, it is often difficult to understand what its original function was and to trace its biography. But how can we reconstruct the origin of something that already reaches us layered with so many interpretations? Retold, the myth already comes with footnotes. It seems that studying myth is like excavating, uncovering layers built by different generations. If we follow a timeline of the history of myth, we can understand at their base that many of them have common elements around which they are built. In the case of the Trojan cycle, we have a historical element. In the case of the Argonaut cycle, a geographical one, that is, myths that explain temples, statues, and territories. In this way, myth justifies something in the real world, often serving as its only source of understanding. Without myth, would we have any means of accessing these ancient worlds? Myths breathe life into the people who inhabit them. Helen, Achilles, Odysseus, all these figures existed in some way, and it is myth that grants them immortality. Even if they were ancient gods who lost their form, as some claim about Helen, real humans or inventions, myth preserves, nourishes, and keep them from fading, always reflecting on the world in which they existed and the social experience they represent. Following our timeline, we find myths embedded in the great epics of Homer. The epics are centered on actions, even if already destined and planned for the heroes. The reasons behind the decision to act are rarely explored. Reflection is removed from the hero and displaced to the divine plane or that of fate. They do it because it's their destiny. Actions begin to be analyzed and value judgments are assigned to the hero's deeds with sophistic thought, the basic seed of philosophy. It is here that mythological re-evaluation becomes evident, along with the first literary and folkloric analysis of what was once sacred. Myths become great repositories of moral and social lessons taught to children as educational tools. Plato, in idealizing his perfect city, Callipolis, expels both myths and poets from his republic. According to him, both would be corrupters of thought and truth. There is no reason in mythological truths, only emotions and passions. Centuries later, myths are revived in tragedies, grand theatrical plays born from Greek lyric poetry, which portray elevated actions, as Aristotle states. Staged during the Dionysian festivals, large rural celebrations that overtook cities at the end of the 5th century before our era. These tragedies serve as public meditations on mythological episodes. This is the case with Aeschylus, who explores the endurance of Zeus in Prometheus Bound. With the emergence of names like Sophocles and Euripides, there is a shift and maturing in the themes. Myths remain the basis of tragic elaborations, but now they provide a poetic universe that mirrors the inner truth of the human being, increasingly explored and reviewed. Tragedies, then, humanize the myths and their characters without ever stripping them of their grandeur. Quite the opposite, their greatness deepens. Tragedy shows a hero's pain, reflecting the most intimate anguishes of the human soul. And all of this happens even before our era, contributing to the growing reflection on myths and their expansion. What is revealed is, in fact, a constant reaction between these forms of thought, the evolution of suffering itself, of the way of thinking and being. As time goes on, philosophy expands and Greek rationalization intensifies. Myth then begins to be increasingly interpreted and rationalized, over-explained. In this process, myth becomes emptied of its original meaning and even its very reason of being. This emptying favors the rise in Christianity, which takes advantage of this rationalization to discredit myths as mere inventions, in contrast with the idea of a single God. Have the myths been defeated by the discourse of reason? Logos took total control of mythos. Or was it merely transmuted, waiting to be heard again in another form? Silence was not final. For centuries, they continued to echo almost unnoticed in the arts, in popular traditions, and in the cultural symbols of the West. Time, curious and cyclical, would inevitably always bring them back. Chapter 6: Myths in the Face of Modern Science. Many years after the Renaissance, when myths get back to the cultural analysis, it is in the 19th century, amid the fervor of great archaeological expeditions and the rediscovery of ancient Greece, that myths return to the halls of European thought to be studied academically. Initially, scholars saw Greek mythology as a primitive attempt to explain natural phenomena, a symbolic discourse born from linguistic and cognitive impotence in the face of the world. As time went on, the study of mythology evolved toward identifying, through the comparative method, traits of the Indo-European matrix present in Greek myths, while also recognizing influences from many other cultures. In this context, mythologies are understood as the result of an evolution in common rituals, the so-called primeval source, the starting point of comparative mythology studies. Located in the Aegean and bathed by the Mediterranean, Greek civilization absorbed much of what developed around it and influenced other cultures. There are, for example, Greek mythological justifications to explain why the Egyptian gods are represented as animals. According to the Greek, they were actually Hellenic deities disguised. This becomes even more evident when we observe certain Greek myths with archaic roots in territories when Indo-European language and culture never established themselves. Thus, the Indo-European heritage is not sufficient to explain all the elements present in Greek mythology. More recently, mythology has also been regarded, especially after the famous Freudian theories of Oedipus and Electra, as the subconscious of ancient peoples, incorporating everything that was repressed and suppressed, to use a thoroughly Freudian term. In this sense, it does not matter so much that the morality and social norms we know today had not yet been created or consolidated. The method is commendable. Through renewed reflection on myths, they gain new life, new interpretations, and new developments. In conclusion, our journey into the myth does not end here. In fact, this is where it begins. Each narrative, each symbol, each god or hero is an invitation to see again, to think again, to rediscover ourselves under new masks. As we follow this path of images and ideas, we realize that no matter how epic or mythological these stories may seem, they remain about us, about our fears, desires, dilemmas, and hopes. Perhaps this is why myths never die. They lie in wait for new voices to awaken them and give them another form, another breath, another chance at life. To face them with a 21st century mind may seem an anachronism, and it is, but it is also an act of reinvention, almost a necromantic ritual of resurrection, a way of unearthing themes, meanings, updating significance, and adding new layers. The footnotes, now written in e-readers, PDFs, blogs, or vlogs, are the proof that the ancient world did not die. It lives, not as ruin, nor as seed, but as a field, always fertile, and a sea, always willing to receive us for a new dive into what it means to be human.